There is a secret in this story that most people won't see coming. And when it finally comes out, everything changes. Margaret Boateng had a 6-bedroom house, 2 luxury cars, a jewelry box worth more than most people's savings, and 3 grown children who hadn't called in months. On a Monday morning in March, she packed 1 suitcase, left her keys on the kitchen counter, and walked out the front door. She didn't take the cars. She didn't take the jewelry. She didn't leave a note. 3 years later, her youngest daughter found her living in a 1-room apartment above a bakery, teaching children to read for free. And when she asked her mother why she left, Margaret's answer made her sit down on the floor and cry. Welcome, welcome. Please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Now tell us, where are you tuning in from? Dallas, Durban, maybe Bridgetown or Toronto? We read every single comment. Now, let me take you back to the house Margaret left. Because to understand why a woman walks away from everything, you first have to understand what everything looked like. The house was on Ridgemont Drive, at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood where the lawns were cut on Wednesdays by services that came in trucks with trailers and left everything looking like a photograph. The house was brick, dark red brick, the expensive kind, the kind that ages well and knows it. 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a kitchen with granite countertops and a double oven Margaret had used exactly twice. A living room with a white carpet so clean it looked like nobody lived there, which, by the end, was almost true. A backyard with a swimming pool that turned turquoise in May and got covered with a tarp in October, and spent 5 months a year being nothing but a rectangle of dark canvas collecting leaves. The house smelled like lemon furniture polish and the lavender diffuser Margaret kept on the entryway table. It smelled clean. Not warm, clean. There is a difference, and Margaret knew it. She had lived in that house for 22 years. She and her husband, Richard Boateng, had bought it the year their oldest was born. Richard was a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon who put broken bones back together for a living, and who came home most nights too tired to put anything else back together. He was a good man. Not a bad man, not a cruel man. A good man who had slowly, over 22 years, become an absent man. He left for the hospital at 5:30 in the morning. He came home at 8, sometimes 9, sometimes not at all. He ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling his phone, chewing without tasting. He said, "How was your day?" and didn't wait for the answer. He kissed her on the forehead before bed, the same spot, the same pressure, the same automatic gesture, and fell asleep in 90 seconds. Margaret didn't blame Richard. That's the thing people didn't understand later when the story got out. She didn't leave because she was angry at him. She left because she had disappeared inside her own life and nobody noticed. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard. Margaret Boateng was 59 years old the day she walked out. She was a tall woman, 5'9", with dark skin that still held its smoothness, though the lines around her eyes had deepened in recent years. She had high cheekbones, a wide mouth, and hands that were elegant and strong, and had spent years doing nothing more demanding than arranging flowers and signing checks. She wore her hair in a silk press, sleek, straight, the kind of hair that required 2 hours at the salon every other week, and she dressed the way women in her neighborhood dressed, carefully, expensively, invisibly. Clothes that said money without saying anything else. She was from Ghana originally, from Kumasi. She had come to this country at 19 to attend university. She met Richard in her 2nd year. He was a medical student. She was studying education. They married at 23. She got pregnant at 24. She never finished her degree. That is the first crack in the story. The degree. The thing she put down to pick up everything else. But what happened next changed everything. The children. 3 of them. Let me tell you about each one, because each one is a thread in this story, and you need to see all the threads before the fabric makes sense. The oldest was Derek. Derek Boateng was 34. He was built like Richard, tall, broad, with the same jaw and the same way of standing that took up more space than his body required. He was a corporate lawyer at a firm downtown. He wore suits that cost $2,000. He drove a car that cost $90. He lived in a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a refrigerator that contained exactly 4 items: protein shakes, leftover Thai food, a bottle of champagne from a party he threw 6 months ago, and guilt. The guilt was invisible, but it took up the most shelf space. Derek hadn't called Margaret in 4 months when she left. Not because he didn't love her, because he was busy. That word, busy, was the currency of Derek's life. He traded in it, he spent it. He used it to pay for every absence, every missed dinner, every Sunday he meant to drive to Ridgemont Drive and didn't. He was his father's son. He just didn't know it yet. The middle child was Yvette. Yvette was 31. She was a marketing executive at a beauty company. She was sharp, ambitious, and exhausting in the way that certain high-performing people are exhausting. She moved through the world like a blade, cutting through obstacles with a smile that was efficient rather than warm. She had her mother's height and her father's tunnel vision, and her own particular gift for being present in a room without being available in it. She called Margaret once a month, on the first Sunday at 4 o'clock for exactly 12 minutes. She asked the same questions. "How are you, Mom? How's Dad? How's the house?" And she listened to the answers the way you listen to a song you've heard so many times you stop hearing the words. The youngest was Abina, named after Margaret's grandmother. Abina was 27. She was different from her siblings, softer, slower, less certain. She had dropped out of one college and transferred to another, and graduated with a degree in social work that Derek called a nice hobby, and Yvette called not very strategic. She worked at a community center on the west side of the city, running programs for low-income families. She made $32,000 a year. She lived in a small apartment with a roommate. She called Margaret more than the others, every 2 weeks, sometimes more. But even Abina's calls had become shorter in the year before Margaret left. Not from lack of love, from the exhaustion of trying to be the bridge between a family that had stopped meeting in the middle. There was one more person, a woman named Comfort. Comfort Mensah. She was 63, a Ghanaian woman who had been Margaret's closest friend for 30 years. They had met at a Ghanaian community gathering the year Margaret arrived in this country, when they were both young and far from home and holding cups of palm wine and pretending they weren't homesick. Comfort was short, round, and had a laugh that sounded like someone dropping a bag of marbles on a hardwood floor. Sudden, chaotic, impossible not to smile at. She worked as a home health aide. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where the lawns were not cut by services, but by the people who lived there, sometimes with push mowers that left uneven lines. Comfort was the only person Margaret told before she left. The night before, Sunday evening, Margaret called her and said, "I'm leaving tomorrow." Comfort said, "Leaving where?" Margaret said, "Everything." Comfort was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Where will you go?" Margaret said, "I found a room, above a bakery on Morrison Street. The baker's name is Helen. She has a spare room, $75 a week." Comfort said, "Margaret, that neighborhood." Margaret said, "That neighborhood is where people live, Comfort. Real people. People who say good morning and mean it." Comfort was quiet again. Then she said, "Does Richard know?" Margaret said, "Richard won't notice for 3 days. And when he does, he'll call Derek, and Derek will call Yvette, and nobody will call Abina because nobody ever calls Abina first, and they'll all decide I'm having a breakdown because that's easier than asking themselves whether they broke me." Comfort said, "You're not broken, Margaret." Margaret said, "No, I'm not. That's why I'm leaving." And that was only the beginning. Margaret left on Monday morning. She woke at 5, before Richard, before the hospital alarm, before the world demanded anything from her. She packed one suitcase. Clothes, simple ones, cotton dresses, flat shoes, a cardigan, her Bible, a photograph of her mother in Kumasi, standing in a market with a basket of yams on her head and a smile that said, "I carry what I carry and I don't complain." Her passport, $400 in cash. She left the jewelry box on the dresser. She left the car keys on the kitchen counter. Both sets, the Mercedes and the Lexus. She left her credit cards. She left her phone. She left the house the way you leave a hotel room, with the things that are yours and none of the things that belong to the place. She walked out the front door. She walked down Ridgemont Drive, past the Wednesday lawns and the matching mailboxes and the houses that looked like photographs. She walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. She waited 11 minutes. She got on the number 7 bus. She rode 40 minutes to Morrison Street. She knocked on the door of a bakery called Helen's. A woman opened it. Helen Park, 58, Korean American, flower on her apron, reading glasses on her forehead, the kind of woman whose face was a map of every early morning she had ever worked. Helen looked at Margaret and said, "You're the one who called about the room?" Margaret said, "Yes." Helen said, "Come in. I just made scones." Margaret carried her suitcase up a narrow staircase to a room above the bakery. One room. A single bed. A window that looked out onto Morrison Street. A small table. A chair. A bathroom down the hall that she shared with Helen. The room smelled like yeast and butter and something underneath. Age, wood, the honest smell of a space that had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Margaret set down her suitcase. She sat on the bed. She looked out the window at Morrison Street. A narrow street with a laundromat, a barber shop, a dollar store, and a community center with a mural on the side that someone had painted in colors so bright they made the building look like it was shouting. She took a breath. A full, deep, complete breath. The first one she had taken in years. Not because she hadn't been breathing, she had, technically, but because the breaths in the house on Ridgemont Drive had been shallow, careful, measured. The breaths of a woman trying not to disturb anything, trying not to take up too much space in a house with 6 bedrooms. This breath was different. This breath filled her whole chest. This breath said, "I am here." But what Margaret's children didn't know yet was that their mother hadn't lost her mind. She had finally found it. Richard noticed on Wednesday. 2 days. Not 3, as Margaret predicted. She had underestimated him slightly, which she acknowledged later as the first time she had overestimated him in years. He came home Tuesday night and assumed she was already asleep. He came home Wednesday night and found the bedroom empty, the closet half cleaned out, the car keys on the counter. No note. He called Derek. Derek called Yvette. Nobody called Abina first. Derek drove to Ridgemont Drive on Thursday. He walked through the house like a detective, looking for clues. He opened the jewelry box. Everything was there. He checked the bank accounts. Nothing had been withdrawn except $400 from the ATM 3 days earlier. He checked the car. Both vehicles in the garage, untouched. He called Yvette and said, "She didn't take anything. Not the jewelry, not the cars, not the credit cards. She just left." Yvette said, "That doesn't make sense." Derek said, "I know." Yvette said, "Is she having an episode?" Derek paused. Episode. The word people use when they can't imagine that a person's actions might be rational. He said, "I don't know. Maybe." They filed a missing person report. The police took the information. A detective named Harris, 47, tired, competent, looked into it. He found no signs of distress, no signs of foul play, no signs of anything except a woman who had packed a suitcase and walked out. He told Derek, "Sir, it looks like your mother left voluntarily." Derek said, "My mother doesn't just leave." Detective Harris said, "Sometimes the people we think we know the best are the ones we know the least." Nobody called Abina until Friday, 4 days after Margaret left. Yvette called her at noon. Abina was at the community center, setting up chairs for a parenting workshop. Her phone buzzed. She saw Yvette's name and knew something was wrong because Yvette never called outside the first Sunday at 4 o'clock. Yvette told her. Margaret was gone. No note, no phone, no explanation. Abina stood in the community center with folding chairs stacked around her and her phone pressed to her ear, and she said something that stopped Yvette cold. She said, "Did anyone ask her if she was happy?" Yvette said, "What?" Abina said, "Before she left, in the months before, did anyone ask Mom if she was happy? Not, 'How are you?' Not, 'How's the house?' Did anyone sit down and look at her and say, 'Mom, are you happy?'" Yvette was quiet. Abina said, "I didn't either, and I should have." Now here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Margaret didn't want to be found. Not yet. She had things to do first. Things that couldn't be done in a house on Ridgemont Drive with a white carpet and a covered swimming pool, and a husband who kissed her forehead at the same angle every night. The first week, she slept. She slept 12 hours a day. Not because she was sick, because she was tired. Tired in the deep, structural way that you don't notice until you stop moving. The tiredness that accumulates over decades of being needed without being seen. She slept, and she woke, and she ate Helen's scones, and she sat by the window and watched Morrison Street, and she breathed. The second week, she walked. She walked the neighborhood. She introduced herself to the laundromat owner, a man named Ray who was 70 and who told her the entire history of Morrison Street in 45 minutes without pausing for breath. She met the barbershop owner, a woman named Teresa who cut men's hair and women's hair and children's hair, and who had a sign on her wall that said, "Every head tells a story." She walked past the community center with the bright mural, and she stopped and read the flyer taped to the door. The flyer said, "Volunteers needed. Adult literacy program. No experience necessary, just patience and a desire to help." Margaret looked at that word, patience. She had 22 years of it. She went inside. The program was run by a woman named Dorothy Hayes. Dorothy was 67, a retired teacher with bifocals and a cardigan collection that rivaled a museum. She had been running the literacy program for 11 years, mostly alone, mostly underfunded, mostly fueled by the kind of stubbornness that keeps candles lit in the wind. She needed volunteers. She needed people who could sit with an adult who couldn't read and not make them feel small about it. Margaret said, "I don't have a teaching degree. I never finished my education degree." Dorothy looked at her over her bifocals and said, "Can you read?" Margaret said, "Yes." Dorothy said, "Can you sit still?" Margaret said, "Yes." Dorothy said, "Can you listen without judging?" Margaret said, "That's the only thing I've ever been good at." Dorothy handed her a workbook and said, "Welcome aboard." Margaret started volunteering 3 days a week, then 4, then 5. She sat with adults, men and women, young and old, immigrants and lifelong residents, who could not read. She sat with them at small tables in a room with fluorescent lights and motivational posters, and she opened a workbook to the first page and she said, "Let's start at the beginning." She was good at it. She was extraordinary at it. She had the patience of a woman who had waited 22 years for someone to see her. She never rushed. She never sighed. She never checked the clock. When a 40-year-old man named Robert struggled with the word because for 10 minutes, Margaret sat with him and they sounded it out together. Because. Because. And when he finally said it correctly, his face broke open with a pride so big that Margaret felt her own eyes fill. She told him, "You did that. Not me. You." Robert said, "Nobody ever sat with me that long before." Margaret said, "Then nobody was paying attention." Stay with us, because the story is about to go somewhere nobody expects. 3 years passed. 3 years of Morrison Street and Helen's Bakery and Dorothy's literacy program. Margaret's life became small and full. She paid her $75 a week. She ate simply. She wore cotton dresses and flat shoes. She let her silk press grow out and her natural hair, gray now, silver in the light, came in thick and coiled, and she wore it in 2 twists that she pinned with bobby pins and didn't think about for more than 30 seconds each morning. She had 23 students in those 3 years. 14 of them learned to read at a functional level. 6 of them went on to get their GEDs. Robert, the man who struggled with because, got a job as a warehouse supervisor that required him to read shipping labels and safety manuals. He came back to the center after his first day and brought Margaret a card. It said, "Thank you for because." She kept it on her windowsill. Comfort visited every Saturday. She brought Ghanaian food, jollof rice, kelewele, groundnut soup, and they ate together in Margaret's one room above the bakery and talked about everything except Ridgemont Drive. Comfort never told the children where Margaret was. Margaret asked her not to, and Comfort kept promises the way she kept friendships, permanently. Richard called Comfort once, 6 months after Margaret left. He said, "Do you know where she is?" Comfort said, Yes. He said, Is she safe? Comfort said, Safer than she's been in 20 years. He said, Will you tell me where? Comfort said, No. When she's ready, she'll tell you herself. Richard was quiet. Then he said, Tell her I miss her. Comfort said, Richard, with all respect, you missed her for years. You just didn't know it. And now, 3 years later, Abina found her. Not by accident, by searching. Abina had been looking for her mother quietly, slowly, the way she did everything, with care and without announcement. She didn't hire a detective. She didn't use technology. She used her training as a social worker. She knew that people who leave voluntarily don't go far. They go to the place that feels most like the self they lost. She thought about her mother. She thought about what Margaret loved before she became Mrs. Boateng of Ridgemont Drive. Before the 6 bedrooms and the granite countertops and the silk press and the lavender diffuser. She remembered something, a memory from childhood. She was 8 years old. Margaret had taken her to a community center on the west side of the city. Not Abina's community center, another one, smaller, now closed. Margaret volunteered there on Saturday mornings. She read to children. Abina sat in the corner and watched her mother sit on the floor with 4 kids clustered around her, reading a picture book about a caterpillar, doing the voices, making the children laugh. Margaret's face that morning was different from her usual face. It was open. It was lit. It was the face of a woman doing the thing she was built to do. Abina remembered that face. She had never seen it again. Not in 20 years. Not at Christmas. Not at birthdays. Not at Sunday dinners where everyone sat at the dining room table with the mahogany surface and the chandelier above and talked about everything except the fact that the woman at the head of the table had gone quiet. Abina started calling literacy programs, community centers, libraries, churches. She called 47 places in 2 months. On the 48th call, she reached Dorothy Hayes. Dorothy said, Margaret? Yes, she's here every day. She's our best volunteer, has been for almost 3 years. Abina drove to Morrison Street on a Thursday afternoon. She parked across from the bakery. She walked into the community center. She asked for Margaret. A young man at the front desk pointed toward a room at the end of the hall. Abina walked down the hall. The door was open. She stood in the doorway and looked inside. Margaret was sitting at a small table with a woman, mid-30s, nervous, gripping a pencil like a weapon. Margaret was leaning close, pointing at a word in a workbook. She was saying, Sound it out. You know this one. Take your time. Margaret's hair was silver. Her dress was plain cotton. Her shoes were flat. Her face was... Abina stopped breathing. Her mother's face was the face from the community center when Abina was 8. The open face. The lit face. The face of a woman doing the thing she was built to do. Abina's legs gave out. She sat down on the hallway floor, right there outside the door, and she put her hands over her mouth and she cried. Not from sadness, not from relief, from recognition. The recognition of seeing your mother, really seeing her, for the first time in your adult life, and understanding that the woman you thought you knew was a costume, and the woman inside the costume had been waiting for decades to take it off. Margaret heard the sound. She looked up. She saw Abina in the doorway. Her hands went still on the workbook. Her student looked at her and said, Ms. Margaret, you okay? Margaret said, Yes, sweetheart, I'm fine. Can you practice that page for a minute? She stood up. She walked to the doorway. She looked down at her youngest daughter sitting on the floor with tears running down her face and mascara smudging under her eyes and the same wide mouth Margaret saw in the mirror every morning. Margaret sat down beside her, on the floor, in the hallway of a community center. 2 women sitting on the floor the way Abina had sat on the floor of a different community center when she was 8 years old and watched her mother read to children and saw a face she wouldn't see again for 20 years. Abina said, Mom. Margaret said, Hi, baby. Abina said, I've been looking for you. Margaret said, I know. Abina said, Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you leave a note? Why didn't you take your phone? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "Because if I told you, you would have talked me out of it. Derek would have called a doctor. Yvette would have called a therapist. Your father would have kissed my forehead and said, 'Let's talk about it tomorrow.' And tomorrow would have become next week, and next week would have become never. And if I took my phone, I would have answered it. And if I answered it, I would have gone back. And if I went back, I would have died in that house, Abina. Not from illness, from vanishing." Abina pressed her hands harder against her mouth. She said through her fingers, "Mom, what do you mean?" Margaret looked at her daughter. She said, "Do you know what it's like to live in a house with 6 bedrooms and feel like you don't have a room? To cook dinner for a man who eats standing up and never tastes it? To call your children and hear them check off a list of questions they've already stopped listening to the answers for? To wake up every morning and put on expensive clothes and expensive hair and sit in an expensive house and realize that none of it, not one piece of it, is actually you?" Abina lowered her hands. Margaret said, "I was an education student, Abina. I wanted to teach. I wanted to sit with people who were learning and help them see what they couldn't see yet. That's who I was. And I gave it up. I gave it up for your father and for you children and for that house. And I don't regret giving it up, because giving it up gave me you." But somewhere along the way, the giving became the whole thing. I gave and I gave and I gave, and nobody noticed when I ran out, including me. She paused. She touched Abina's face, the way mothers touch their children's faces when they're trying to say something their mouths can't hold. She said, "I left because I was disappearing, baby. Not from the world, from myself. And I needed to go find the person I was before I became everyone else's everything and nobody's priority. Not even my own." Abina sat on that floor and felt the sentence land in her chest like a stone dropped into a well. She heard it hit the bottom. She heard the echo. She said, "Did you find her?" Margaret smiled. The open smile. The lit face. She said, "She was right here, sitting at a table with a workbook, helping a man learn the word because. She'd been waiting for me." Abina leaned against her mother's shoulder. Margaret put her arm around her. They sat in the hallway of the community center while fluorescent lights buzzed above, and Dorothy walked past and saw them and kept walking, because Dorothy was the kind of woman who knew when a moment was not hers to enter. Abina said, "I'm going to tell Derek and Yvette." Margaret said, "I know." Abina said, "They're going to be angry." Margaret said, "I know that too." Abina said, "Dad has been... he's different. He eats at the table now. He sits down. He told Derek last month that he wasted 20 years coming home too late." Margaret's face changed. Something softened. Something that had been held tight for a long time loosened half a turn. She said, "That's a start." Abina said, "Mom, will you come home?" Margaret looked down the hallway, at the room where her student was practicing a word, at the walls with the motivational posters, at the floor she was sitting on, hard, cold, institutional, and she said, "This is my home now, baby." "But your home, Ridgemont Drive, your father, your family, that's still mine too, just differently." She paused. She said, "I'm not coming back to be the woman in that house. She's gone. But I'll come back as the woman I am now, if there's room for her." Abina said, "There's always been room. We just filled it with the wrong things." Margaret pulled her daughter closer. She kissed the top of her head. She smelled Abina's shampoo and her lotion, and the particular scent of a child you carried inside your body and carried outside your body, and carried in your heart every day whether they knew it or not. She whispered, "You turned out exactly right, you know that?" Abina said, "I got it from you." Margaret laughed, a small laugh, a real one. The kind that starts in the belly and rises through the chest and comes out sounding like something you thought you'd lost. Derek came the following Sunday. Yvette came with him. They drove to Morrison Street together in Derek's $90,000 car, and they parked on a street where nothing cost $90,000, and they walked into the community center and found their mother sitting at a small table with a workbook, wearing cotton and flat shoes, her silver hair in twists, looking like a person they had never met. Derek stood in the doorway. His jaw was tight. His $2,000 suit was creased from the drive. He looked at the room, the folding tables, the plastic chairs, the fluorescent lights, and he looked at his mother and he said, "Mom, what is this?" Margaret looked up. She said, "This is where I work, Derek." He said, "You don't need to work. You have—" She said, "I have a 6-bedroom house and a jewelry box and 2 cars I never drive. I know what I have. Do you know what I didn't have?" He didn't answer. She said, "A purpose, a single reason to get out of bed in the morning that didn't involve polishing a counter or arranging flowers or waiting for a phone call that came every 4 months for 12 minutes. Yvette flinched. She knew the 12 minutes were hers. Derek sat down heavily in a plastic chair. He put his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor. He said, "Why didn't you say something?" Margaret said, "I said something every day, Derek. I said it with the dinners I cooked that nobody tasted. I said it with the phone calls I made that nobody answered. I said it by sitting in that house for 22 years while my education degree sat unfinished in a drawer. I said it 1,000 ways and nobody heard me because you were all too busy being busy." Yvette's eyes were red. She said, "Mom, I called you every month." Margaret said, "You called me on the first Sunday at 4 o'clock for 12 minutes and asked me how the house was." The house, Yvette. Not how I was, how the house was. As if the house and I were the same thing. Yvette pressed her hand against her mouth. She sat down in the chair next to Derek. The two of them, the corporate lawyer and the marketing executive, the expensive suit and the expensive dress, sat in plastic chairs in a community center on Morrison Street and looked at their mother and saw, perhaps for the first time, that the woman they had been taking for granted was not the woman sitting in front of them. The woman sitting in front of them was someone new, someone they needed to meet. Abina stood in the corner. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She just stood there, holding her bag, watching her older siblings catch up to the realization she had arrived at on a hallway floor 3 days earlier. Margaret said, "I love you, all 3 of you. I left that house because I loved myself enough to stop disappearing. And I stayed away for 3 years because I needed to become the person I should have been all along. Not your mother. Not Richard's wife. Not the woman in the big house. Me. Margaret. The woman who teaches people to read." She stood up. She walked to Derek. She put her hand on his cheek, his clean-shaved, expensive aftershave cheek, and she said, "You are your father's son. And that's not an insult. Your father is a good man. But a good man who doesn't see the people around him is a good man standing in an empty room. Don't stand in an empty room, Derek." Derek's jaw loosened. His eyes filled. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." She said, "Don't be sorry. Be present. That's all I ever wanted." She turned to Yvette. She said, "Call me when you want to, not when the calendar tells you to. And when you call, ask me something real. Ask me about Robert, who learned the word because. Ask me about Dorothy, who runs this program on nothing but stubbornness. Ask me about Helen, who makes the best scones I've ever had, and who lets me live above her bakery for $75 a week. Ask me about my life, Yvette. My real life, not the house." Yvette wiped her eyes. She nodded. Margaret looked at Abina. She didn't say anything. She just opened her arms. Abina crossed the room and walked into them, and they held each other, and Abina said quietly, "I asked Dorothy about you. She said you're their best volunteer." Margaret said, "Dorothy exaggerates." Abina said, "No, she doesn't. I asked 3 students too." That evening, Margaret took her children to Helen's bakery. Helen made tea and set out scones and looked at the 3 adult children sitting at the small counter and said, "So you're the ones. Your mother talks about you constantly. She loves you very much. But she's happier now. I hope you can see that." Derek looked around the bakery, the flour-dusted counters, the glass case with the pastries, the narrow staircase leading up to his mother's one room. He said, "Mom, you could have anything. You could live anywhere." Margaret picked up a scone. She broke it in half. She said, "I have exactly what I need, baby. A room with a window, a table with a workbook, a woman downstairs who makes scones and doesn't ask me to be anyone other than who I am. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how many people spend their entire lives in 6-bedroom houses and never feel at home?" Derek looked at the scone in his mother's hand. He looked at her face, the silver hair, the flat shoes, the open smile. He said, "You're really not coming back." Margaret said, "I'm not going back. There's a difference. I'll come forward, to family dinners, to holidays, to Abina's apartment and your apartment and Yvette's apartment. I'll be your mother every day for the rest of my life. But I'll be your mother from here, from this street, from this bakery, from the room where I found myself." She ate the scone. She poured more tea. She looked at her 3 children sitting in a bakery on Morrison Street, wearing their expensive clothes and their complicated feelings, and she said something that settled in the room like dust after a storm. She said, "The house on Ridgemont Drive had 6 bedrooms, and not one of them was mine. This room above the bakery has 1 bed, and it's the first bed I've slept in for 22 years where I woke up knowing who I was." Yvette reached across the counter and took her mother's hand. Derek put his arm around Abina. The 4 of them sat there in Helen's bakery while the late afternoon light came through the window and turned the flour dust gold. 6 months later, Margaret and Richard had a conversation, their first real one in years. Not in the house on Ridgemont Drive. Margaret refused to go back there. They met at a restaurant, a simple one. Margaret wore her cotton dress and her flat shoes. Richard wore a button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. They sat across from each other, and Richard said, "I kissed your forehead every night for 22 years, and I never once asked you what you were thinking." Margaret said, "I know." He said, "I'm selling the house." She looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it was never a home. It was a building I kept you in while I went to work. And a woman like you doesn't belong in a building. She belongs wherever she decides to stand." Margaret reached across the table. She took his hand. She said, "You've been practicing that line." He said, "For about 6 months, yes." She almost laughed. Then she did laugh. And Richard laughed too, a sound Margaret hadn't heard in so long it surprised her, like finding a photograph of someone young in a drawer you forgot to open. They didn't get back together. Not in the way people expect stories like this to end. But they got closer. Richard sold the house. He bought a smaller one, 3 bedrooms, a garden, a kitchen where he learned to cook, because Margaret had once told Comfort, "I want someone to cook for me for once in my life." And Comfort had told Richard, and Richard had enrolled in a cooking class at the community college and was, by all accounts, terrible at it, but trying. Margaret stayed above the bakery. She stayed at the literacy program. She stayed on Morrison Street, where Ray at the laundromat said good morning, and Teresa at the barber shop said good morning, and Helen made scones every morning, and the mural on the community center wall shouted its bright colors at a street that needed the noise. Derek started calling every week. Not 12 minutes, as long as it took. He asked about Robert. He asked about Dorothy. He asked his mother things he had never asked before, about Ghana, about her mother with the yams, about the education degree she never finished. Margaret told him. She told him everything, and for the first time, he listened the way listening is supposed to work. Not waiting for his turn to talk, but hearing what she said and carrying it. Yvette quit the calendar. She called when she felt like it, sometimes twice a week, sometimes once. But when she called, she asked something real. She asked, "Mom, what did you teach today?" And Margaret told her about a woman named Esperanza who learned to write her own name for the first time at age 52. And Yvette cried on the other end of the phone and said, "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." And Margaret said, "It is, and I was there for it." Abina came to Morrison Street every Saturday. She brought groceries. She sat in on the literacy classes. She brought her community center kids to meet Margaret's students, and the 2 groups, children learning to read faster and adults learning to read at all, sat in the same room and read the same books. and it looked like what education is supposed to look like when nobody is keeping score. One Saturday, Abina brought a frame. Inside the frame was Margaret's old university transcript, the one from 30 years ago, the education degree she never finished. Abina had called the university. She had found out that Margaret was 6 credits short of graduating. 6 credits. 2 classes. 1 semester. She said, "Mom, I enrolled you." Margaret looked at the transcript. She looked at Abina. She said, "I'm 62 years old." Abina said, "Dorothy is 67 and she runs a whole program. Helen is 58 and she wakes up at 3 a.m. to make bread. Age is not an argument, Mom. It's an excuse." Margaret took the frame. She held it against her chest. She closed her eyes. She said, "Your grandmother carried yams on her head for 40 years and never complained." Abina said, "And you'll carry textbooks for 1 semester and finish what you started." Margaret finished. She graduated in May, 62 years old, cap and gown. The ceremony was at the university stadium. Margaret sat in the back row because she got there early and liked the view. Derek was in the stands in a suit. Yvette was next to him, clapping before Margaret's name was even called. Richard was there, smaller now, quieter, standing alone in a button-down with rolled sleeves, holding a bouquet of flowers he had picked from his garden because he thought store-bought flowers were impersonal, and his cooking teacher had told him that the best gifts are the ones you grow yourself. Abina was in the front row. She held up a sign. It said, in careful handwriting, the same handwriting Margaret used in workbooks every day, "She found her room." Margaret walked across the stage. She shook the dean's hand. She held the diploma, a piece of paper, just a piece of paper, but weighted with 30 years of waiting and 3 years of becoming, and 62 years of a woman who carried what she carried and didn't complain. She looked out at the stadium, at her children, at Richard, at Comfort, who was in the 5th row, crying and laughing at the same time, which sounded exactly like a bag of marbles hitting a hardwood floor. At Helen, who had closed the bakery for the afternoon, which she had never done in 20 years. And Margaret Boateng, the woman who walked away from a 6-bedroom house and found a 1-room apartment above a bakery and a table with a workbook and a word called because, and a purpose she had been carrying inside her for 30 years without knowing it. Margaret Boateng held that diploma in both hands and smiled. The open smile, the lit face, the face of a woman who had finally stopped disappearing. And she whispered, to nobody and to everybody, to her mother in Kumasi and her students on Morrison Street and the girl she had been at 19 with a suitcase and a dream she put down and picked back up again 30 years later. She whispered, "I am here." And she was. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.